This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.
This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. I'm working on some new interviews for you, but in the meantime, I thought it would be good to surface an old interview with Mark Russell from May 2019. Mark Russell is a writer of both books and comics, and he's been on the show twice. His first book, God is Disappointed in You, is a hilarious retelling of the Christian Bible, which is followed by a sequel featuring apocryphal scriptures called Apocrypha Now, which is just as good. Fans of shows like Sunday School Dropouts and the new Irreverent podcast, Go Home Bible, You're Drunk, will appreciate these books. However, as a comic book reader, it's his graphic storytelling that really grabbed my attention. His breakout book was a 12-issue run on the Flintstones for DC Comics, where he used Fred and Wilma and the other cast of characters to make incisive and impossibly sincere social satire. He continued his work with Hanna-Barbera characters with a 6-issue run of Snagglepuss, with the titular character being cast as a closeted playwright during the McCarthy era. Of particular interest to evangelical listeners, though, Mark also writes the comic book Second Coming, which features Jesus Christ as the main character. In that book, Christ is sent back to Earth by God to room with Sunstar, a Superman analog, because his dad thinks it will toughen him up. Evangelicals and other fundamentalists were so worked up about the mere announcement of this book that over 200,000 people signed a petition calling for its literal cancellation, which DC Comics promptly did, before a single issue was published. Thankfully for the public, it was picked up by the publisher Ahoy Comics. Volume 1 is available in trade now, and the second volume, Second Coming, Only Begotten Son, is being published in single issues right now. I had another conversation with Mark specifically about this book, which you can find in the feed. What has stuck with me from this conversation, even years later, is what Mark Russell has to say about the limitations of superhero narratives. Around the 55-minute mark, Russell says that the problem with superheroes is this sort of embedded idea that the only thing that will save the world is if the good guys are even better at violence than the villains. I'm thinking about this now, as the U.S. vaccination rate is on the rise and as the movie release schedule of Disney and other studios reasserts itself, as well as within the background of the real world and the regular mass shootings we see here in the U.S. and the atrocities we're seeing in Palestine now. I know that I'll use those stories that Disney and others publish through Marvel Studios for a sense of escape and, yes, even inspiration. And I know that I'm excited at the prospect of seeing a movie like Black Widow in the theaters. But I also know that I have to look beyond this cartoon violence and find other ways to make it more just and sustainable society. Hell, even the fictional characters themselves are reckoning with these questions in series like Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Yet fiction provides a safe place for us to imagine new realities, and that's what Mark Russell excels at. I hope you get a sense of that from this interview and that you use the links in the show notes to look up some of his work. You can follow me on Twitter at brchastain. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at exvangelicalpod. You can like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/exvangelicalpod. You can also support this show and my writing directly via paid subscription to the Post-Evangelical Post, which is currently hosted on Substack at postevangelicalpost.com. Free tiers are also available. You can also support the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. This show was edited by Jake Lewis. Thank you very much, Jake. All right, everyone, let's get into it. Hi everyone, welcome to Exvangelical. My guest this week is Mark Russell. He is the author of the book God Is Disappointed in You, as well as the book Apocrypha Now, and is the author and writer of many comic books, including The Flintstones, Snagglepuss, and more recently, Red Sonja. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad you agreed to come on the show. Thanks for coming on. I discovered your work a few years ago when somehow your book, God Is Disappointed in You, came across somewhere online, and I was super happy to read it. It was really, really funny. And then a couple of years later, I learned that you were then writing comics. But before we sort of get into your work, where we like to sort of start on the show is just talking about your sort of initial background and what your sort of first experiences with religion were like, whether that was as a child or at some other point in your life.
Yeah, well, I was pretty much raised in a evangelical church. So my first experiences with religion, like genuine personal experiences, didn't really happen until I started sort of doubting my religion. Because to me, it just felt perfectly natural. It was like just part of our daily routine. Mm-hmm. It was the water in which I swam in. So it didn't feel like I was actually having a religious experience. It was probably why I ultimately began challenging it, because for me, it was just, like going to school or, getting dressed in the morning. It wasn't like an experience that sort of really made me feel connected to the rest of the universe. It was just something I did as a matter of routine.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I started like getting older and started like sort of needing those experiences that made me feel connected to the rest of the world or to the greater human experience, that I began sort of questioning whether or not I needed my particular religion in order to experience that.
Yeah. So we can often get sort of in the weeds in this show as far as, actually talking about what sorts of denominations people were brought up in. So did you come up in like a non-denominational sort of evangelical environment, or was there a certain tradition that you were a part of?
We were Pentecostals, like Foursquare.
Okay. And was this like a church environment where you sort of your family went on Sundays and through the week and that sort of thing?
Yeah, we went not only on Sundays, but usually Wednesday evenings as well. Mm-hmm. It was not a casual thing. It was something that was woven into the fabric of our lives.
Mm-hmm. And what about your school? Did you attend public school, or did you attend a Christian school or homeschool, or?
Some of both. I mean, all three, actually. I homeschooled a little bit in the 8th grade. I mostly went to a Christian school during elementary school through middle school, and then I went to a public high school.
Okay. So you hit all the bases. And
yeah, I've seen education from basically all the parallax points.
And what was that like for you growing up? I mean, I don't know whether you were self-aware of those sorts of shifts and that experience, but in retrospect, what was that sort of like for you?
Well, in retrospect, I think they all have kind of their own assets and problems. And I think the problem with the public school education I received was that it was sort of, one size fits all. So it was very easy to sort of slip through the cracks. And, if you didn't want to take advantage of an education, you didn't have to. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Christian education, I felt, was very heavy on indoctrination and very light on sort of academic improvement. But at the same time, you did get a lot of individualized attention, and you could not really slip through the cracks because there was always people there checking on you. And the homeschool I felt worked very well for me, but only because I was very self-motivated. I would actually get up and do the work, but the homeschool approach made my education, I think, a little lopsided, because I would do a lot of work and get very far ahead in the subjects I was interested in, and not so much the things I didn't care about.
Oh yeah.
And I think I'm still that way to this day. It's like I'm sort of an idiot savant. I've really well-read and well-versed in subjects that I care about, and am probably below subpar in things that just don't have any sort of meaning to me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very relatable. I sort of, my parents used to call me one track, or like OT, because I would sort of get on one track and stick to it
Right.
for a long time. So that's
And
very,
the homeschooling really sort of enabled that.
yeah. What about sort of social aspects of this religious milieu you were in? Was there different Sunday schools and like youth groups? I know, like in the 90s and 2000s, youth group culture was like this big thing, and I don't know if that was when you were going through this, and if that's your age group or not.
Yeah, it was more like the 80s.
Okay.
But yeah, youth group was pretty big. I mean, it was where you met most of your social peers. And I think that's why they do that, because the youth group is where you get the social reinforcement that your parents can't give you. It's like you ultimately at some point, everybody starts being raised not by their parents, but by their friends. And I think that's when the evangelical churches cracked that code and realized that people were leaving the church because they were being raised by their friends, and their prom dates, and not by their parents who wanted them in church. That's when the emphasis started on the youth groups. It's like, well, the way you make people afraid to leave, or keep them interested in the church, is not with the church itself. It's with the social group, the people they care about, making it difficult for them to leave those people behind.
Yeah.
And that's when the emphasis on youth group and surrounding people with social peers who are also in the youth group, and having your activities and your social activities sort of like center around the church and the faith. That's when that became really big. It's a form of totalitarianism, really, but it wasn't toxic in my case. It wasn't like they were going to come after you if you did something wrong, or if you tried to leave the church. It was just it was a pleasant totalitarianism. It's like, we're just going to make it very easy for you to stay in the church and not to question anything, because you don't want to like leave all these friends behind.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really well put. That's the sort of way in which young people begin to sort of indoctrinate themselves. I think I've seen that sort of play out in a lot of different sort of circumstances, and youth group is like a really, really good example of that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in the youth group had similar sort of questions or similar sorts of doubts that I did. But it's like they didn't want to like make the pizza sleepovers awkward. They didn't want to like miss out on the trip to the Enchanted Forest. So they pushed those doubts to the back and went along with the program.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because there's a lot of groupthink in those circumstances too. You don't.
Yeah, they make it very attractive. They make it very comfortable. The whole the reason why groupthink is a thing is because it's much more comfortable than breaking from it.
Right. So you have mentioned that a couple of times that you started to develop these doubts, and it was actually when you first mentioned it, you said that it was motivated by this sense of trying to connect to something. When did you really start to feel those doubts, and how did you experience those?
Probably when I was in high school, and it was largely just being exposed to people who didn't believe the same thing I did. Like, oh, there's other ways of looking at the world, and oh, this person is not a member of my church or even my faith, but they're an even better human being than I am.
Yes.
So what does that say about, it's like everything. It's kind of like the lies that you're told when you're a kid get peeled back one by one. Like, oh, people who don't have this faith are lost, and they can't, this is what makes you a good person. It's like, well, no, I actually know a lot of good people who are, not part of this faith at all. Or, it's like, oh, this is the only way to heaven, and anybody who doesn't come this way is going to burn in hell. And then you realize when you're in school, like how many people that means, like how many people don't share this faith with you. You begin to wonder to yourself if you're really that lucky that you just happen to be born into the one particular faith. And not only the faith, but the one sort of branch that faith, because I'm pretty sure we all thought that Catholics were going to hell too.
Right.
But, the one sort of sliver of that faith that just happens to be the one that God likes the most. Just seemed a little too lucky to me. And, it occurred to me that like the other people in other religions probably feel the same way about their faith. And not only that, but the people who feel that way about their faith are probably the jerks. So it made me wonder, it's like, well, am I one of the jerks? Am I one of the jerks for Christ? The same way, like Al-Qaeda might be the jerks for Islam.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were in high school, that's when you stepped back and sort of saw the environment that you were in that new light.
Yeah, you just learn more about the world. The more you learn how much bigger the world is than the little incubator of faith that you grew up in, the harder it becomes to sort of universalize your belief into something that works for everybody or that everybody should believe.
Yeah. And within this sort of Pentecostal environment, Pentecostalism is not an area that I am super familiar with. My background is more like Methodist and Wesleyan, which is more buttoned down than
Pentecostal. You guys, I think Pentecostalism and the evangelical movement kind of sprung from that, but it was a much more sort of emotive I think it was like Methodism adapted for people who burned out on drugs during the 60s. It's like sort of Methodism for hippies.
Yeah, like the Jesus movement and a lot of
exactly.
Yeah. There's Jesus people here in Chicago where I am. Like still today, there's a commune like a couple miles from where I live.
Yeah. And we weren't like that. I mean, I grew up in it. My mom grew up in it. So it wasn't like my parents were, these crunchy hippies that burned out and decided to, join a church. It was more kind of like those were the people that this faith attracted because it was very sort of emotionally based. It was a way to sort of replace the alcohol or the LSD. It was a cheap way to replace the acid that they were used to.
Gotcha. So within that tradition, what was the sort of approach to the Bible? Was it seen in the way that a lot of evangelical or fundamentalist type churches view it, which is sort of it's the inerrant word of God?
Yes, it was 100% literal. Which you mentioned my book, God Is Disappointed You. One of the things I quickly realized when I wrote that book is that the more literal you take the Bible, the less you know about it. Because it's impossible to interpret it literally. I won't try to disabuse anyone of their faith because I feel like someone's faith is like a form of self-medication. It gives them what they need out of the world. But if anybody thinks that the Bible is the literal word of God and tries to like impose that interpretation upon others, I will not hesitate but to burst that bubble for them.
Yeah, and that's fair.
Yeah. That's just for the good of the planet.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking as someone who lived inside that bubble, that it's a hard one to have popped, but it's necessary in a lot of ways. So what was that sort of like for you? For some people, that is not the easiest sort of thing to reconcile. Changing opinion on the Bible. A lot of times that's really painful. Like I went to college to be a pastor, and then I started studying the Bible in Greek, and then I realized, oh shit, I thought this was like perfect, and it's definitely not.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why it's so impossible to take it literally, because it was originally written in Greek, and so there's translations involved. And if you take the translations literally, then suddenly it makes no sense. Like, for example, the Greeks had no word for homosexual. To them, that would be like us having a word for someone who only eats chicken. It's like, no, sometimes you feel like chicken, sometimes you feel like steak, sometimes you feel like shrimp. That's the way the Greeks sort of approach sexuality. It's like, what do you mean, somebody who only likes someone of the opposite sex? Or what do you mean somebody who only likes someone of the same sex? That makes no sense. Your sexuality is whatever you feel like at that time. So they didn't have a word for homosexual. So when Paul was writing about homosexuality in Greek for, imposing Judeo-Christian values on the Greek language, he had to actually come up with a neologism to describe this activity. And what he came up with was a word arsenokoitai, which literally translates to man liar, which means that if you believe in a literal translation of the Bible, you believe that Paul is not only condemning homosexual men, but you believe that he is literally condemning heterosexual women who are also man liars.
Yeah.
So, it's like once you begin really studying the Bible, the sort of literalism just crumbles beneath your feet. And yeah, so I can see to me, the real question is how anybody comes out of a seminary or any sort of Bible college still really believing in the Bible as the fundamental, inerrant Word of God, and not as I see it, people struggling with the question of what God expects from them here on earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it being a collection of a culture wrestling with that over 1,500 years.
Yeah, and to me, that's 1,000 times more profound and more valuable to think of it that way. It's like, oh, these are people struggling with the deepest, most interior question of their lives, not just like some owner's manual that they found on the side of the road that was written by a god who then disappeared.
Yeah, so let's talk about your book a little bit. Your book, God is Disappointed in You, because it's this retelling of the Bible in a sort of sarcastic, sardonic way, but you also work in like some really genuine and also profound things to say in the way you retell the Bible. How did you start to develop that, and what was the genesis of that particular project?
Well, it was really trying to explain the Bible to friends who didn't have a Christian upbringing, basically at bars. So this is how you would explain the book of Job to somebody at a bar. This is how you would explain the creation story to someone at a bar. So I basically that was the central concept. It's like, this is the Bible explained to somebody as you would at a bar. And I think that since then I've kind of developed the rule that you don't really understand anything unless you can explain it to somebody in a bar.
That's great. Yeah. Some of the passages that stick out to me was like, you say that Jacob wrestled angel and was renamed Israel, and Israel to date is the only country named after a wrestler.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when you think about it. Like, that's a name that stuck. But to me, it's a funny name, but at the same time, this is like kind of where we should go back to being one who wrestles with God. The evangelicals, I think, go wrong because they think they're done wrestling with God. Like, no, we get God. No, we understand exactly what God wants from us. And we know because we have this Bible, which is the 100% literal and not open to interpretation Word of God. It's like, no, the reason why Israel went on to found a great nation, and the reason why he created a faith that was meaningful to so many millions of people afterward, was precisely because he wrestled with God. He fought against what God actually wanted, and ultimately came to an agreement with him. That's what we need to be doing in our own lives, whatever our religion. It needs to be the product of interior struggle, not the product of like sort of smug arrogance, thinking because we were raised in this faith or because we have this book that we believe in, that we have all the answers.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So when you were writing this book, what was your thinking about how to retell the Bible from just telling someone in a bar in a sort of relaxed way? When you were writing the book, what was your approach to different sections or different types of, because there's all these different genres even in the Bible. So there's all the early histories, and then there's the law, there's poetry, there's all the prophets. What was the writing process like for you?
It's, sort of like building a railroad, in that, some places are very flat and even. It's very easy to lay down the tracks because you're just telling a straightforward history. And then other places are, you've got to like use dynamite to blast through a mountain. Books like the Book of Revelation, which reads like a horrible fever dream.
Yeah.
Or the Book of Psalms, which is 150 chapters of poetry, basically songs. Those are much more difficult to condense than, say, First and Second Kings or even the Gospels, which tell a relatively straightforward narrative. So yeah, the process changed from book to book depending upon what I was doing. one problem I ran into when I was reading the Bible, doing my research, is that the Bible doesn't include a lot of the historical context it needs to understand itself.
Right.
For ancient readers, this probably wasn't a problem because, all of a sudden Habakkuk is, screaming about the Assyrians. If you were alive at the time he was writing, you would know what the Assyrians had done. You would be familiar with, you wouldn't need someone explaining to you. It'd be like if you were a reader, like a reader today wouldn't have to have someone explain to them what 9/11 was.
Right.
It's like you could just write an essay about 9/11 and everyone instantly know what you're talking about. But 2,000 years from now, if the essay didn't actually explain what 9/11 was or what happened or the events leading up to it, you would be lost. And I think that's the problem with people reading the Bible without the historical context needed to understand it, is that they turn the page and all of a sudden somebody's yelling at the Assyrians. They think they understand it, but they have no idea what is actually being said or what's going on because it lacks the historical context.
Right.
So I tried to bake a lot of that back into the Bible. Like I would have passages, even though technically they aren't included in the Bible, where I would explain the historical context or why this book was written the way it was. And in fact, that's sort of the central question I tried to ask myself with each of the books I was condensing. I was like, well, why does this book exist? What was it that the author really wanted to say? And I would try to condense it down to that essential message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that comes across. You have a very good economy of language in both of your books as far as just being able to communicate a lot of things in not very many words. And so hearing you say that the idea is you're trying to summarize this for someone in a bar, in retrospect, having read your books, that makes a lot of sense in how it's written, and really in that way that feels like a summary if you've read the Bible before. But if you haven't, it gives you the highlights, and your sort of commentary throughout is really, really great. I'm thumbing through because I was sort of surprised reading through the New Testament sections that you even made Paul sort of palatable. For a lot of people, Paul is not a great read. And one of the things you say, though, is like, let's be honest, what we're asking people to believe doesn't make a whole lot of sense. All we can really do is tell them about Christ and hope they bite, which is more straightforward than a lot of modern translations of Paul.
Yeah, and that's, one of the things I actually kind of admire about Paul is that he was honest I think because he lived not surrounded by people who agreed with him, that he went out into like the Hellenized world, and he understood how crazy the story of Christ sounded to somebody who was more interested in like sort of Platonic argument or Aristotelian logic. He understood how crazy this would sound.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very open about that when talking with other Christians. He basically said, and these are his words, you are called upon not to be, debaters or philosophers, but to be fools for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
To be somebody who believes this in spite of themselves. And our job is really to find the people who are willing to believe this despite the fact it doesn't make any sense to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other sort of element of your book that I appreciate is that it has this element of irreverence that strikes you, but at the same time, it's there in the story. And I feel like a lot of times if you come from an evangelical background, you're sort of trained to not see that part of stories in the Bible. A lot of people act really freaking human in the Bible, but we sort of valorize them into ways that make them appear just to be these sort of like sterile saints.
Yeah, and that's one of I think the things that you cheat yourself out of if you employ this sort of, 100% literal, inerrant, sort of non-contradictory version of the Bible in your mind, is that you cheat yourself of a lot of that humanity, a lot of that struggle that people go through. I mean, the New Testament, when you read it, and when you read it with the understanding the historical context that was going on between, the Church of Jerusalem and then the Paul's churches, up in the Hellenistic world, a lot of it is about James and Paul talking smack about each other.
Right.
Like accusing each other, basically, Paul accusing James of being old-fashioned and not understanding that they are creating a new religion. And James basically accusing Paul of being, a pagan who is abandoning Judaism and turning Christ's teachings into something that Christ never intended. And how could you argue with somebody who was the brother of Christ? It's like, I think I know what he thought. I shared a bunk bed with him for 18 years.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and really this is the sort of central conflict that informs the New Testament. And it's a lot more interesting and a lot more, it gives you a lot deeper understanding of Christianity when you see it that way than if you just imagine that they somehow all got along and agreed 100% on everything, which they clearly did not.
Right. I didn't know any of that sort of aspect of it until years later when I read Reza Aslan's book Zealot. He talks about that aspect between Paul and James, and it was fascinating.
Yeah. And James was the one who was sort of like the presumptive favorite. He was the one that like people sort of respected and thought would carry on the message of Christ. And Paul was some wacko, like out in the middle of nowhere, just writing letters to people.
Yeah.
Whereas James had all the gravitas. It wasn't until the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem that with it, the church that James started and James himself, that Paul kind of became the torchbearer for Christianity. If they had killed Paul instead of James, Christianity would be extremely different today.
Right.
I mean, they did eventually kill Paul, but not until
Right. But that would definitely be a very different alternate history.
That and Paul's version of Christianity was much more palatable to the Gentile world because you didn't have to get circumcised for one thing, which was a huge, sort of recruitment barrier.
Right.
Especially if you're an adult male.
Yeah.
And, and he made it so that this could actually become a global religion, not just like sort of a sect within Judaism.
Let's talk a little bit too about your second book in that series, which is called Apocrypha Now. And you actually tackle the apocryphal texts, both within Judaism and Christianity. So what drew you to wanting to do that project and apply this same sort of approach to those texts?
Well, when I was researching God Is Disappointing You, I was reading a lot of sort of extra canonical texts to get myself, context and to understand what a lot of the canonical books were about, because they refer to these non-canonical books a lot in the Bible. Like, for example, Isaiah tells the story of Satan, or then Lucifer, like trying to wage a palace coup against God, about him not wanting to serve God and therefore trying to overthrow him, failing, and then being cast down to earth. That story appears nowhere in Genesis. That only appears in the Bible in Isaiah. So he's not referring to the Bible when he's telling the story. He didn't make it up. He obviously had familiarity with the oral Torah of the Jewish faith, and so what we would now call the Midrash, the big body of Jewish folk beliefs and oral traditions that informed the written Torah. And it's hard to really say that you understand the Bible without also understanding the traditions and that it came from. And, another example is, Jesus himself has a story where he casts the demons out of a woman and he says, "Behold, one greater than Solomon is here," which kind of, seems weird. Why Solomon? Why would you compare yourself to Solomon, after casting out a bunch of demons? Because Solomon is known to people in the Bible as, either a king of Israel or also just like someone who wrote a lot of really cool proverbs. But there is in the Jewish tradition a book called the Testament of Solomon, which describes his career as an exorcist. And there's a whole book about him basically being granted this magic ring by God that allowed him to capture the souls of demons. And he would go around and capture demons. And according to this book, that's how he built the temple.
Oh, wow.
That he enslaved all this demonic labor and forced them to do the really hard work of building the temple. But that's something that we don't really have in the Christian tradition. But it's obvious from the Christian tradition and the Bibles and the canonical Bible that Christ knew this story, that this is what he was reading. So in doing this research, I thought, wow, not only is this necessary for understanding the Bible, but there's just some really great stories in here that it's a shame that more people don't know. The whole tradition about Peter being crucified upside down, opposed to being crucified, right, set up like Christ.
Right.
That doesn't come from the Bible either. That also comes from the Acts of Peter, which is
Mm-hmm.
a Gnostic gospel, which was banned in the 3rd century or the 4th century AD, and was supposedly destroyed. But luckily, some people had enough foresight to hide a lot of these heretical Gnostic texts at a site called Nag Hammadi, and they discovered them in 1945. So it's basically enough to sort of double or triple the New Testament was found. Was utterly missing until 1945. And so I thought, how can I tell the story of the early Christians and not include what most of the early Christians were writing or thinking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to your point, like, there are some great stories, like in the sort of apocryphal stories about Jesus as a kid being a real jerk, like just sort of tormenting his fellow kids and his parents and his other people's parents and his teachers.
Again, is much more gratifying than the idea of Jesus just sort of like, coming out like a holy card.
Right.
And sort of being perfect from day one. Is like, could you imagine what that would be like to have the powers of God and yet the sort of mind of a child, and what it would take to sort of like show, learn the discipline to control that and become, a good shepherd.
Right.
It's like, to me, that's much more profound and much more sympathizing and humanizing to Jesus than the idea that he was just this baby who was born morally and pure and perfect in every way.
1 Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.
Everybody, just breaking in here to again let you know there are a couple of ways to support the show. First, you can do that by just letting some folks know about the show in person or online. Second, you can rate and review the show over on Apple Podcasts. That is still the place to leave your reviews for podcasts, and it's a big help to us podcasters. And I know I just said a couple, but here's a third. You can also support the show via Patreon over at patreon.com/evangelicalpod. Again, I hope you're enjoying this episode, and we'll get right back to it now. So after having written these books, you actually get a position writing for DC Comics. So you start writing for DC. Was it your first gig doing, or your first job for DC doing the Flintstones? Is that right?
No. The first thing I did for DC, and actually the first comic book I wrote for anyone, was a comic book called Prez.
Oh, okay. So Prez came first. Okay.
Yeah. Prez was the first comic book I got from DC. It was, in 2015. And so they were thinking, someone had the idea to bring back the Prez comic book, which I don't know if, your readers, this might be too obscure for most people to know about, but there was a comic book that ran for about 4 issues in 1973, 74, created by Joe Simon, who also created Captain America, about this teenager who becomes president. And it was, because it was the early 70s, the 25th Amendment had just passed, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. And I think there was a lot of this sort of hippie fear at the time, like, oh, great, now that we've given 18-year-olds the right to vote, they're going to be taking over the country. They're going to, be putting hippies into office, and they're going to, there's going to be like a Native American guy who's in charge of the FBI, and I think a lot of it was like half of it was like their attempt to sort of come up with a comic book that the kids would really like, sort of their easy writer. But half of it was also sort of like informed by this sort of subconscious fear that the hippies were going to take over everything.
That tends to boil out in comics just because they can be produced so fast. I feel like social anxiety.
Yeah, that's what a lot of them really express is this sort of angst, the malaise of the zeitgeist.
Yeah. Prez made this weird sort of cameo in a Sandman story, in Neil Gaiman's Sandman. And that was where I didn't even realize that it was another character.
And I think that was like Neil Gaiman, just trying to be obscurantist, I'm going to tell this story about Prez and nobody will know who he is. But, there's this character that actually, was part of the DC universe in 1973. So, yeah, they basically hired me to reboot it in the run up to the 2016 election because they thought it'd be a good time to sort of reboot this obscure comic book. So I did it. I changed it to being set in the near future, like about 20 years from now. And it's the first election decided by Twitter. You can vote on Twitter. And this girl named Beth Ross wins the election and becomes president because she goes viral at just the right time. And so it's really sort of a parody of instant celebrity and of like politics in the 21st century.
That feels eerily accurate in light of how 2016 happened.
Yeah, right. Now, I guess now it would be the second election decided by Twitter.
Yes.
But yeah, so that was my first comic book, and it only ran for about 6 issues.
Yeah, that was a good comic book too. I mean, you sort of tackle different things like within the sense of and like welfare. Welfare's not the right term, but like sort of food is subsidized by like essentially like Taco Bell, just delivering drones. Taco drone. That's right.
Yeah, these taco delivering drones that it basically the welfare system, the food stamp program is taken over by Taco Bell basically. And the price you pay for getting this free food from Taco Drone is constant surveillance because the drones are always keeping an eye on you. And also you have to then become a living advertisement for Taco Drone. It's like they give you quote unquote funwear. So these brightly colored sort of purple and orange bodysuits advertising Taco Drone that you must wear at all times now because you're accepting this free food.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, that also feels eerily.
I hope that's not prophetic. It very well could turn out to be. But yeah, it was just about the privatization of our institutions, the privatization of our empathy for other human beings, and about how everything is becoming, all human relationships are being reduced to their transactionality. That's kind of what I was just trying to capture with that image.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like you can't even it'd be like, if to go back to religion, if Christ were to give people loaves and fishes, but then made them take like a keychain, like a Christ keychain, or, told everyone that they had to get baptized first.
It sounds like Samaritan's Purse, but that's just another story. The next thing that you write then after this, I had the chronology wrong, is then you work on the Flintstones series.
That's right.
Okay. Within the context of this licensed property, it's a Hanna-Barbera property that DC has access to. And, people know the Flintstones. It's part of our background. If someone was writing an essay, talk about like making cultural references, as we were talking about earlier, Flintstones is one thing that most people know. But you use this commonly known property to sort of explore these big questions about civilization, really. And the way you set it up is that like Bedrock is really the first go at like human civilization. How did you develop that idea? And I mean, I just felt like that was very successfully executed and a great way to examine a lot of these big questions. How did you start to develop that?
Well, they gave me the Flintstones, I think, because they felt bad about Prez being canceled. But I know that DC really liked Prez, but it didn't sell very well, so they had to cancel it. So they offered me the Flintstones instead. And yeah, I was never really a big fan of the Flintstones. To this day, I don't think I have a hard time getting through a single episode of it. But I thought to myself, well, if they give me a property to write, as long as it allows me to write about things that I actually care about, then what does it matter if I'm a big fan or not? And so that's kind of the way I approached the Flintstones. It's like, well, what do I care about in relation to the Flintstones? And what I cared about was, the fundamental flaws of civilization, like where human civilization went wrong, the ways in which our institutions have failed us, and the way in which we fail each other by dehumanizing each other. And so that's kind of what the Flintstones became about how people back then were easily duped into falling for the things that we are still falling for today because they had no experience with civilization before. And in a way, they're kind of more admirable than we are because they have an excuse. This is all very new to them.
Right. Yeah, different issues are sort of address different things. Like there's one issue. It's a 12-issue run, and I recommend anyone listening pick up the 2 volumes of it because they're great. One issue will do something like tackling sort of consumerism, and like malls are sort of invented.
Yeah, not only malls, but just stuff.
Right, stuff.
There's like a newscast about this crazy new trend of owning physical objects.
Right. Yeah.
And it just people go nuts for it. It's like I can go into this place and they will sell me a hat. I don't have to make my own hat. It's glorious.
Right. Yeah. And so one of the characters that obviously I think a lot about religion and its impact on society, and one of my favorite through lines is the proto-pastor character that you have. He's really given a go at monotheism. Like that's his thing. And the god is called Gerald, and really trying to get people to listen to him, really. Tell me a little bit about that character and how that was developed too.
Well, he starts as an animist priest, because like the humans started as animists, worshiping the forces of nature because they seemed mysterious to us. They seemed like they knew what they were doing. And in fact, there's when he starts, like they worship this bird god named Morp. And because Morp is when they were hunter-gatherers, Morp would be the one they would follow, south for the winter and north again for the summer. Morp would be the one that would show them where watering holes were because they just follow Morp and wherever he landed, and he would land where there was water. So Morp, this animal god, was incredibly important to them when they were hunter-gatherers living with the same sort of struggles in nature that Morp was living. But then when they settled down and founded a city and, settled down and had civilization, animals became a lot less mysterious. They became livestock. They became pets, or they became, in the case of the Flintstones, appliances.
Right.
So you feel kind of silly when you realize that you're actually the bird you're worshiping is actually the record player.
Right.
Or the elephant you are worshiping is the vacuum cleaner. It's like, why am I worshiping a vacuum cleaner? So the solution to this quandary created by civilization is to abandon animism and begin worshiping an invisible god that cannot be commodified. And that is Gerald. And his symbol is the empty throne.
One of my favorite parts is of that sort of storyline of Fred and Wilma giving a go at monotheism is when they actually go in one issue on a marriage retreat, and they are seen as the sort of radicals of their time because monogamy had just been invented. And there are signs of protesters that say things like God hates dads, and like just go and then like some old couple decries them and says, just go back to the sex cave,
Right, which is where we spent most of our human existence,
right.
In the sex cave.
Right. So, and then there's a section where Fred gives this really impassioned defense of this couple, Adam and Steve. He just delivers this really, really wonderful response because the pastor doesn't want to acknowledge this gay couple. This is a sort of thing that Christianity in the West continues to struggle with. Like even this week, as we're talking, the United Methodist Church is probably on the verge of a split over the issue of affirming LGBTQ people. I'd love to hear just about how you developed that particular story and why you put that moment in, because that one really resonated with me and was just such a great scene to have incorporated into this popular comic book about the Flintstones.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I really wanted to be a reaction to, people sort of trying to create, cast their prejudice against LGBTQ people as being just merely being in favor of traditional marriage. Like, it's Coke or Pepsi, and I just happen to prefer Pepsi. When in fact, it's like, if you prefer Pepsi, that doesn't mean you have to legally bar anyone else from drinking Coke. But for some reason, the advocates of quote unquote traditional marriage feel just that way, that in order to support traditional marriage, you have to like bar LGBTQ people from marrying who they want to, which is not just, a question of stopping people from marrying each other, but it has very real ramifications in every other facet of life, because then they can't adopt kids. They don't even have the right to be with their significant other when they are dying in a hospital. So it's not just a question of marriage. It's really about, do you even have rights to be around the people you love? And it's much more fundamental than they make it out to be. But, my sort of historic problem with that approach, other than the fact that it's, unfair and I think dehumanizing, is that, it's like, well, traditional marriage doesn't really exist. Because marriage is itself a brand new institution. It really only has existed in, maybe within the last 8 to 10,000 years. And we as a species have been around on the planet for about 250,000. So it is itself a brand new thing as human institutions go. So I thought, well, it'd be cool to like talk about this, at the beginning of marriage, when this was itself being treated like gay marriage, because it was such a brand new institution and you're changing everything, and all the same arguments that people are making against same-sex marriage now could have been applied against, opposite, any sort of marriage back then. And thereby, reducing how ridiculous these arguments.
Right. Yeah. And it's very, very effective. It's one of my favorite parts of your series.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a very elegant metaphor that presented itself. I'm amazed that like nobody's kind of like been making these arguments before.
Right. Yeah. You sort of explore issues in regards to LGBTQ acceptance even further in your run on Snagglepuss, which carries on this Hanna-Barbera license with DC, but you reimagine Snagglepuss as this closeted playwright in the McCarthy era. So you took the Flintstones and made Fred Flintstone and the other characters in Bedrock into these extremely thoughtful characters that were examining civilization and its strengths and weaknesses. What was the thought and the pitch for doing something similar with something like Snagglepuss?
Well, the funny thing about Snagglepuss was I originally didn't even realize I was pitching it as a comic. I was just writing things on Facebook, little conversations. Seriously, I was just writing little conversations between Snagglepuss and Huckleberry Hound as though they were, Southern Gothic playwrights, sort of talking this very sort of purple prose to each other. And my editor, Marie, who happens, also to be a Facebook friend, just emailed me out of the blue and said, by the way, if you want to do your Snagglepuss comic, I got it greenlit. So I was like,
that's amazing.
Well, okay. So then I had to actually come up with a Snagglepuss comic, but I just thought I would kind of follow that same sort of story. And, with Snagglepuss, it's like, well, what are the two things we know about Snagglepuss? It's like, well, one is that he's a gay icon. And two is that he has a background in theater, because all of his, both his catchphrases are theater references. Exit stage left is obviously a theater stage direction. And Heavens to Murgatroyd is a reference to, I think, a Gilbert and Sullivan musical. So I thought, well, what would have happened to force him to go from the stage to cartoons in 1959? And that's when the whole story of him, like, sort of running afoul of the Lavender Scare and, the House Un-American activities in the 1950s just sort of like suggested itself.
That's great. Another great series that sort of, again, examines social norms and the ways in which people, just by existing, deviate from them.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I do want to pivot, though, and talk a little bit about an upcoming work that you have, which really goes, again, back to these issues of religion. This new book you're working on, another comic book called Second Coming. So what's that book about?
The short story is it's about Jesus Christ coming back to Earth and sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with a superhero. The idea being that God, when he originally came down to Earth, God thought he was going to be more like him, like projecting power, smiting the wicked, sort of ruling with strength. And when Jesus did not, and was subsequently crucified, God was horrified by that. So he sent him back down to learn from the superhero the way to rule the earth and the human race with a sort of an iron fist. But what ends up happening is kind of the opposite. The superhero sort of like ends up learning just how limited, the ability to like throw someone through a plate glass window or, drop kick somebody into the next county, how limited that is in terms of solving human problems. And that Christ's approach of like empathy and forgiveness and healing is actually much more effective, even though it might mean that you get crucified once in a while.
That is a really interesting scenario to put a Christ figure into.
Yeah, it's part deconstruction of superhero comics and also part deconstruction of Christianity.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, there is a lot of sense of superheroes as modern deities.
Right.
There's this, and I think the book Super Gods, Grant Morrison makes direct parallels between like the Big Seven and Justice League to Greek gods,
Well, and I think that, frankly, Superman or, superheroes are much more natural gods for, say, like modern evangelicals than Christ. Because they respect power. They want him to be the mascot for an empire, whereas Christ was really much more about subverting the empire.
Right.
The problems I think really started when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, because Christ was all about like dropping out, not playing by the rules of people who want to live by fear and kill others, and the Romans were much more about ruling by fear and killing others.
Right.
So it was a very unnatural fit to make this guy who's trying to get people to live without fear or greed and make him the mascot for an empire that was basically run by fear and greed.
Yeah.
And so it created these, necessitated these intellectual gymnastics that have sort of, I think, tainted Christianity to this day. And the sort of prosperity doctrine and then, the name it and claim it churches that you see that are common in the United States today are sort of the natural outgrowth of that, this sort of like attempt to create God in our own image.
Yeah. Do you think clearly, there are other comic book properties. There was like Punk Rock Jesus, which sort of addressed these things head on as far as with the Christ figure and everything. Is that something that as an artist or in this sort of marketplace, something you're concerned about? To me, I think it's a really compelling idea, and it's one that I look forward to reading. This idea of directly comparing these two different approaches to both power and divinity, because superheroes have this representation of the divine and of the superhuman that is just more palatable in pop culture than something that's directly religious.
Well, and I think that the problem with superheroes is this sort of embedded idea that the only thing that will save the world is if the good guys are even better at violence than, the villains.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the embedded ideology in all superhero comics.
Right.
And I think in the 21st century, that's on a social level inherently suicidal. That thinking that that all the world's problems are solved by violence, and we just need to make sure that we're better than everyone else at it. In a global thermonuclear age with dwindling resources, and we will either find a way to feed the masses and help people survive as a species, or we will die all competing for the last can of Spam. And I think that idea that like the solution is just to be better at using physical force than everyone else that the superheroes usually present will lead to the latter scenario, where if that becomes our guide for ethical and moral behavior, we will all die because of it. And so I wanted somebody to propose sort of an alternative.
Yeah, that's very true, because I mean, all of the superhero stories, the only part in which there's rebuilding is in, I always butcher this word, but the denouement. It's in those moments after the battle's done, like this horrific battle, and that comes to mind, like Mark Waid's like Kingdom Come, where Batman turns his costume from black to white, and he like sort of becomes a nurse character instead of the guy that beats up mentally ill people.
The danger of like superheroes kind of becoming like the new gods is that, we've sort of forgotten the teachings of Christ and have adopted professional wrestling as our moral, as our moral compass.
Oh man, I can't picture Vince McMahon in a pantheon. That's upsetting.
So and that's what part of the comic's largely about how we've sort of forgotten what Christ really brought to the earth, which is a moral alternative to that approach.
Yeah, very interesting. So do you have a scope in mind? Do you have like an ongoing series in mind, or is this something that you have like a self-contained story that you'd like to tell in this frame?
I really don't want to ever do an ongoing series. I would think they should all be self-contained, because I want them to end while they're still good, while they're still relevant.
Yeah.
To have an endpoint in mind when I start. So, but I think that this one ideally would run for about 18 issues.
Okay.
I'm signed for 6. Well, I'm not signed for any right now, but I had originally signed with Vertigo for 6 issues, and that's how many I've got written right now. But I would like to eventually do 18.
Yeah, that's a good. What's the industry term? Maxi series.
Yeah.
Awesome. I agree. Generally, those sort of maxi series are much more enjoyable as a reader. Like the things we've sort of talked about right now, like the superhero stuff is good. It's nice to read, but usually it's sort of like the creator runs or what are defined. The ones that are defined are usually very more rewarding overall. It's interesting to hear that from the creator's perspective too.
Yeah, I think that the what you want when you read something is what's unique about the person writing it and drawing it. What you want is their vision, and not like something that is reminiscent of everything else you've written. What you read for is what's unique about it. And so I think that it's okay to do something that's challenging, or maybe even a little off-putting, because ultimately that's what's going to stay with people.
Right. Yeah.
The uniqueness of it.
Yeah. And who is your artist partner in this particular book?
Richard Pace.
Okay. And have you worked with him before?
No, this is our first project together.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, I'm super excited to see that come to light and read your take on that, just because it is a very sort of big dichotomy, that especially relative to the ideas of like strength and power and how you use those superheroes. Yeah, they're all about might makes right in a lot of ways. So bringing that up against Jesus being your roommate.
They're much more of an Old Testament version of power, that like, we better do what these people say, because not because their ideas are good or because what they say is any good, but just because they could burn us into a cinder if we do not. Which is like sort of like the most base, regressive sort of moral idea in the world.
Yeah.
The idea that we still sort of celebrate this or try to come up with new tweaks to make it seem edgy or fashionable, I think really speaks more to our lack of imagination and also our failure to create new possibilities that will allow the human race to survive the 21st century.
Is that something you see as a powerful thing that fiction allows us to do, is imagine those scenarios?
Yeah, and in particular comic books, because they're all thought experiments.
Mm-hmm.
And if you aren't thinking about, the big issues of our day and, human survival, then why are you using a medium like this that's so good at like making thought experiments accessible to people? They don't have to invest a lot of time reading it. They go quickly. You have the whole visual component, so you can explain things in a vision or a visual metaphor much more easily than if you were writing a prose book, and it's more likely to be read by children who are, or at least young people who are going to be at a stage where you're actually influencing them intellectually, and not like some 50-year-old dude who has already decided he's right about everything.
Yeah.
And so given all these factors, and you're writing a comic book, why wouldn't you use it to sort of like help save the human race, or help influence the future?
Right. Yeah. Well, do you have actually I know you can't really talk in regards to timelines or anything. But
no, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
We don't have a new publisher for it yet, because Vertigo dropped it, canceled the orders. So we're looking for a new publisher. But my hope is that it will be out relatively soon.
Great. Awesome. Well, I will sort of update things relative to that when that's available. But overall, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm really happy to let people know about some of your other work. Where can people find you online, Mark? And where can they find your books? And you're also writing Red Sonja right now, is that right? So that's
correct. I'm writing Red Sonja, and I just finished up a run on the Lone Ranger, about the Old West. It's actually a story about the advent of barbed wire, which I thought was really cool, because it utterly changed how everything worked in the Old West. So it's one of these little things that has a huge impact. So I'm doing that. I'm also doing a Wonder Twins comic for DC.
That's right.
The Wonder Twins from the old 70s Super Friends cartoon.
That's right. I read the first issue. It was great.
Thanks. Yeah, so probably the best way to keep track of me and all I'm doing is on Twitter. I'm on Twitter relentlessly, and my Twitter address is @Manruss, MANRUSS.
Awesome.
And then all those books are available at your local comic book store, or if you have to, then Amazon.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to me about your work.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.
First Corinthians warned you about the women with a loud mouth, and this podcast is just that. Here at the Speaking in Church podcast, we talk all about the regular people and the things that regularly happen to them in the evangelical church. It's a podcast about change, it's a podcast about seeking moral high ground, and it's a podcast for people who are just trying to deconstruct on the safe side. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, and if you want to be a guest, yes, you, regular person, you can be a guest on the Speaking in Church podcast. If you want to come on, just let us know.